This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. So I'm so happy that we're able to do this conversation because I feel it's might be years in the making. I say it's months in the making. I think with you and I feel like the last real substantive conversation I had, I was still in graduate school in terms of like some of the things that I wanted to do and some of the things that I'm trying to do. And then I feel like things switched and then you were back in school.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, like I was at Northwestern and then you ended up at Northwestern. So I mean, I think this conversation for me is like intriguing in many ways because I feel like I backdoored my way into journalism and journalism schools. Whereas I think I've always kind of seen and viewed you as someone who I admire as like a storyteller and a writer and someone who really is keen on the craft of what it means to be a journalist. And so not only do you think about it from the lens of someone who is Black and someone who cares deeply about our community that way, but you from the crib. And so that also is very meaningful and that shows up in your work as well. So I just want to give you your flowers in that regard.
Thank
And I
you.
thank you for just even taking the time to
Thank
have this
you.
conversation.
I don't know if you remember like years ago, like when I say years ago, maybe 14 years ago, I interviewed you. You were doing like a recording session at a studio and I interviewed you. I had like a little music blog type entertainment thing and I interviewed you. This was so long ago. I just know I was in my 20s and I'm about to turn 40. So that's how I know how long ago that
I
was.
mean, it happens. I've had people tell me that they got mixtapes that from the club that I would used to hand out back in the day. I've had people tell me that they found promotional flyers from like places like Leaders or the Fly Store, and
Yeah.
it dates me and it makes me, but it also makes me
Yes.
feel good about like the fact that there was just some impact that was done from back then because I feel like we were all orbiting in that space of
Yeah. We
culture.
were all trying to just like find our way, do our
Yeah.
work, be creative. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I just hope that during that time I was not that I had a good day because I feel like I had a lot of interviews and some of
No,
them
you had a good day.
were good and some of them
Yeah.
were bad. Artists sometimes when we're in the midst of like creating, usually I was pretty good about interviews, but I've like sometimes I remember folks being like, "You didn't really talk much," and I'm just like, "Oh man, it must have been a bad day." It's just like had nothing to do with you, but I respect it, and I still, I'd be hard pressed to read that interview, but it'd be interesting to see what I was even thinking about during that period
Yeah.
of time. I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to discuss with you, um, is something that I talk a lot with my students, in particular those who are African American, um, are just like their journey, like their idea of what it means to have a journey into this profession. And I think now more than ever, the profession isn't as linear as it once was. I feel like I've also sat in a number of panels and seen a number of conferences kind of take on this idea that the profession is in a state of flux, could possibly be quote unquote dying. And I'm just like, I don't know how to necessarily um talk to my students about this because they seem to be very anxious and worried about their career journey going ahead. Um, can you talk about sort of your pathway into journalism and sort of
Yeah.
like how you sort of went even from your time at a place like even the Defender to
Hmm.
now being into the space of not only doing your own writing, but teaching others about how to enter into the profession. How have your experiences sort of shaped the way you teach and the way you mentor those who are working
Mm.
with you currently?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a really good question. So I have like a really untraditional way that I got into journalism. And so because of that, I am team, you can just make it happen. You
Mm,
know, it can look very different. Don't really let these restrictions people create, become walls for you.
mm,
Um, when I graduated from Florida A&M, I was in this combined MBA program where you would get your undergrad and your grad, your MBA at the same time. So it was like a 5-year program with internships and all this stuff.
mhm,
And so I was in business and I was so bored because not that business is boring, but because when you first start off in corporate roles, you are not the person making decisions, right? Like you're not making strategic decisions.
right.
You are doing more operational things. You're doing really tedious things. So, like, I was in transportation and
Mm,
I wasn't making big strategic supply chain case study like decisions. I was planning truckloads of paper.
mm,
And I mean, I was great at it, but because I was good at it, when you're smart, it's like second nature. Like you can
mm,
do it in your sleep, right? I'm like,
right.
I knew like so like when you're planning truckloads of paper, you are gonna weigh out first or you're gonna cube out. Like you're gonna reach the maximum amount of weight first, or you're gonna like reach the maximum amount of space before you reach the maximum amount of weight. And
Mm.
I could know that so quickly. And so I would just be zooming through this work. And I was literally like 21, 22 years old. And when my boss was out, I would be his fill-in
Uh-huh.
to run this like big strategic meeting in the morning. And so I'm 22 years old and I'm like, yes. So the updates from this meal is that, our cost per ton is so and so and so, right? And so that's the type of stuff I wanted to be doing. I didn't want to be planning whatever. And so I started writing because I was like, oh, there's online magazines. I never heard of that. Like, that's
Mm,
interesting.
mm,
But it was really hard, of course, trying to pitch yourself. And so
yeah.
I was like, I'll start my own.
Hmm.
And that's when, around that time I was moving back to Chicago and I started just like trying to show up places. And then I started getting like invites to stuff. And then like local PR people would pitch me and I started developing relationships. And that's how I ended up like interviewing so many like artists and kind of people in culture, really.
Hmm.
But then I felt like I hit a point where it was like, okay, but you've never been trained to be a journalist. Like you're calling yourself a journalist and you've never actually been to journalism school. If you really want to do this, you're gonna have to go back to school. So then I went back to school at Northwestern
Hmm.
for their master's program.
Hmm.
Um, and then after that, I worked at the Defender, the Chicago Defender newspaper.
Hmm.
I worked at the Associated Press. I worked at WBEZ. I worked at a nonprofit in Chicago called City Bureau. So, like, I freelanced for a lot of places. And so you start kind of building up stuff. And, um, but I didn't have like that traditional path. Like,
Right.
so many people are like, I worked on my high school newspaper and then
Yeah.
I graduated and then I always wanted to, like, that was not me at
Right.
all.
But it's interesting because I think like at the same token, I remember like being in high school, and I think I probably was that person who thought that they were going to go immediately into the journalism field, and I was a part of there was a all city high school newspaper in
Oh,
Chicago called New Expression, and it was out of like we used to have meetings at Columbia College,
mm.
and I think it since its shift, it kind of serves what True Star is, I guess, today.
Okay.
But
Hmm.
it was a similar notion. Kids from all across the city, we would meet at Columbia, and it was a print. Uh, it was a print magazine slash newspaper, and I wanted to be a sports journalist at the time. But at the same token, like to speak to this nonlinear pathway, like, you go to college and you find yourself wanting to do something else, or you find
Hmm.
yourself kind of understanding that maybe, hey, this pathway that I thought was stable and secure is the thing that I'm just saying that I want to do because it's it's in the way of it's in the way of maybe what I think society expects out of
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
And so I think for many of the students that I interact with and deal with, to your point, I'm telling them to just get out and do what they love and do what they feel. Let the chips fall where they may. And yes, major in something substantive to you and get the grades that you need so that you can, if need be, uh, get a professional track gig that will sustain you. But often to get where it is you actually want to go in today's media environment, you kind of already got to be making things and developing your
Yeah.
voice and branding yourself.
Yeah. And a lot of
Um,
my students do not want to be reporters, and they
mm,
are journalism majors.
hmm.
And I get it, because like traditional journalism can be limiting.
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of rules. There's a lot of things you can't do. So, like, for example, I have students who have huge social media followings who
Hmm.
already make money with brand
Right.
collaborations and stuff that feel natural to them. If
Hmm.
they were to become reporters and work with the newsroom, some of that might have to stop.
Mm.
And I get it. So I think that understanding that they want to be creative, though they all want to be creative, they all want to do stuff. So even the people who don't want to be quote unquote reporters, they still found value in storytelling, but
Mm.
they just all want it to look a different way. Some people want to do more kind of like create their own production company.
Right.
Some people want to do more what I would still say is maybe entertainment reporting, but I think that they may still see it as more like I think they don't want to be bound by reporting. Um, but they want to do just more straight up interviews. So like,
Hmm.
I get it. I get
Hmm.
it. But I think that they still have like they still want to be storytellers. And I think that's the important thing for me is that they still see value in telling a story. And as traditional media changes, as social media platforms change, like all these things are going to keep changing. But what will remain is that if you are a powerful storyteller, you'll adapt.
Hmm. 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 What are your thoughts on this idea of like objectivity and subjectivity? Because I found that like even as I got hired here, my position says, race and media, right? And so the classes I've even been asked to teach are centered in not necessarily just on how we represent those who are from certain identities, certain backgrounds, but it's also kind of this understanding that you can represent your own identity and your own background in the stories that you tell. And sometimes that subjectivity is necessary in order to sort of combat the POV that isn't necessarily respecting the humanity of certain identities. And I feel like in some ways, and I've had like conversations that have been with like alumni of this university where like those who are classically trained in journalism and they're like, wait a minute, like what did we hire you for? Or like is this like is the point
Yeah.
for you to like undo this thing that I know to be one way? Is that what you doing in your classroom? Like, and are these the students that I'm encountering, or like that professors are telling them to be more
Yeah.
subjective? but I'm wondering how you feel about that idea of objectivity and how in today's environment, in today's society, um, in some ways, some folks might deem even the word objectivity or the thought that one has neutrality as being anti-black or as being
Yeah.
anti-woman or even homophobic in some instances. What would your thoughts be on that idea?
Yeah, I usually don't say that I'm trying to be objective because I'm not, I can't be
Mhm.
objective. I don't think that that is possible. But what I will say is that we want to be fair. I always say that in my lessons. Well, how can we be fair? We want to make sure that we're fair, right? Is
Mhm.
it fair to say this? Is
Right.
it fair to leave out this perspective? Is that fair? Right.
Mhm.
And I think that that holds more weight. And like it's a natural way to check yourself. Like, wait, is
Mhm.
that fair? Because I
Yeah.
don't have to like this person. I don't have to like this point of view, but is it fair
Right.
to include it? Right. Is it unfair to leave it out?
Hmm.
Right. Or is it helpful for the reader to include it? Right. Or it might be like, no, it's actually really confusing for the, like if 99% of, and of course I'm making this statistic up, but if let's say
Right.
99% of, scientists who do, who study that type of science believe in climate change and 1% don't, it's actually, oh, excuse me,
You okay?
it's actually really unfair for me to include the perspective of that 1% and give it equal weight. It's unfair.
Mhm.
It's not fair to include it because now I'm confusing the reader. I'm not helping them by
Okay.
trying to do that, right? So that whole idea of both sides isms
Hmm.
I don't believe in. And that is what we were taught, right? It's like you must include both sides. It's like, no, but what perspectives are needed for this to feel like a fair story, to have fair framing? Um, I cannot be objective. I am not an objective human, I believe that there's going to be right and wrong
Okay.
all the time. I'm always going to, as a person, as a human, believe that there is right or wrong, right? But can I treat even people who I think are wrong with decency and respect? Like that I can do,
Mm.
you know? And so just thinking about that, like what is fair to people and what is fair in telling a story. So I usually use the word fair a lot.
That's real.
Um, we do, I feel like sometimes you do, depending on the class, especially, you do have to have the objectivity talk because that's just usually a part of the curriculum because
Yes.
you have to. But even when I was at Northwestern last year, when I was teaching a lot of freshmen there, those first year students coming in, they already didn't believe in objectivity.
Mm.
So, and this is just by the things that they read. So I think that it is interesting because you're going to have those people who are like, well, that's not the right way to teach. And
Yes.
it's like, that's also not even our um, place anymore, right? Because if the students and the young people now don't believe it. So it actually doesn't really even matter what you and I believe because
Mm.
they're not going to believe it.
Mm.
So we're going to have to adapt and work with the change, right?
Yeah.
I've had students really don't want to work places where they feel that they would have to do work that goes against their personal beliefs.
Yeah.
Um, Places they think that are not places of ethical standards. And a lot of that goes because they feel that those places might, in an attempt to be objective, might uplift things that they think are wrong.
I hear that quite a bit. I think that's generational too.
Yeah. Because we
Where
were just trying to, we're like, oh man,
I
I
need a
don't have a
gig.
choice. There's so many things that that I did. And I was like, this doesn't feel great, And sometimes I would push back, but I
Yeah,
just would feel like you have to choose your battles.
that's very real. But in speaking about like storytelling and sort of being fair, I feel like you definitely have an opinion on what's right in terms of Chicago. um, you know, And I feel like you do Chicago great justice. And even in your
Thank
book,
you.
um, We Are the Culture, I think you make an argument that I think a lot of Chicagoans make, right? But you make it in a very, I guess even to think about someone like I don't know if you follow Dilla, the historian
Yes. Hmm.
on Instagram, but like this argument about just how many things Chicago is involved in that have been innovative and important to not only just history but the development of culture and cultural production more broadly, or even sport and politics and all of these facets of our nation. There's like
Yeah.
often there's a person or a family that has ties or roots to Chicago, or there was some event that happened in Chicago that was important, or some meeting, or some just there's so
Hmm.
many
Yeah.
tentacles that Chicago has in our nation's story, but in particular, Black Chicago has a very interesting influence and impact on the ways in which Black folk have sort of, I guess, thrived in this country. And I think
Yeah.
you talk about that in a very logical, not
Hmm.
not biased in the way of being from a place, but actually presenting a argument that makes sense.
Hmm.
What inspired you to sort of write this book, and what do you hope readers take away from it?
Well, I definitely wanted to write a book that I knew something about, because you know how um as like scholars in academia, sometimes people write about things that they study, right? But they have not experienced. But a lot of times we do, right? It's stuff
Mhm.
that we've solely studied and seen. Um, but I didn't want to necessarily do that. And I didn't want it to be anything new either.
Mm.
So I wanted it to be something that was grounded in a lot of my reporting as a journalist, which was a lot of like arts and culture and
Mhm.
history. And then I wanted it to be something that it was like, well, I've experienced this stuff.
Right.
Like I didn't just make it up. I'm not just talking about something that happened somewhere else. Like I have walked the streets and felt it and see it. Like I see it every day, at that
Mhm.
time when I was writing. Like I would be writing about something and then I drive past the location and I'm like, I can still see it and feel
Right.
it, feel that influence. And so I really wanted something to feel right. And what I wanted people to take away from it was that, like, if you're a Chicagoan, I wanted you to be proud,
Mm.
because there's so much storytelling that's created to do the absolute opposite.
Mhm.
And so it's just like balancing that narrative
Mhm.
it is hard. And this is just one book, right?
Right.
There's a lot of people who do fantastic storytelling in Chicago. Like we actually are a place where there's so many people who do so much great writing.
Mhm.
There's so many books that come out by Chicagoans every year that I struggle to read all of them.
Mm.
But I just felt like this could be my contribution to that.
Mm. Why do you think that, Chicago, I feel like in some ways, as much as uh, I guess it falls in line with a number of cities that have vibrant Black communities, or I guess you would call them chocolate cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in news media or in mainstream narratives, Chicago's sort of gotten the short end of the stick in terms of
Yeah, yeah.
wanting to frame, particularly Black Chicago, and
Mm-hmm.
framing it in a way where there's one version being told about the violence, one version being told about sort of the danger of living on, say, the south side or the west side of Chicago. But and it's not just in news, it's in television, it's in motion pictures, it's
Mm-hmm.
in music, it's in a lot of different
Yeah.
spaces. But like every time I've walked someone through my neighborhood growing up, South Shore, or I've taken them to Hyde Park, or I've taken them to Bronzeville, or I've taken them to even places like Chatham or Beverly or wherever, they're surprised as to sort of what they experience, not just in a sense of safety or in a sense of like cleanliness, but in a sense that there's a lot of arts and culture that is very vibrant and different. And I'm just wondering, what is it that has Chicago sort of been made to be sort of the scapegoat for
Yeah.
a lot of this stuff? Or, like what do you see as being sort of the impetus or the reasoning why Chicago as a city is sort of framed as this example of sort of Black violence, Black death, Black trauma, and why that's been like the focus in many times in journalistic representations of the city?
Yeah, I think it's just like it fits a clear narrative that people want to have, right?
Mm,
So we know that there has been disinvestment. There are places that have like a more severe lack of resources than other. But even in those places, right? We know growing up in Chicago, like block by block, you never know, right? You
yeah,
on the right block,
yeah.
a block that got a block club, a great support system of people who look out for each other, that block is going to still be strong and look different. So
Yeah.
the idea that any entire neighborhood is just horrible is just not fair, and it's
Hmm.
just like an overgeneralization. And so no matter how often, every year the FBI comes out with these statistics of the top murder capitals of the
Yeah,
country, and we're never in those top, we're not in them. But it
exactly.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the facts and actual statistics say, right? It is so much easier to point the blame. And then when you have, politicians using us on the national stage
Mhm.
to talk about how violent, the city is, it's like people who've never been there are
Yeah.
like, well, that's all I know about Chicago, right? That's literally all I know. And I guess if you really have never been someplace and you don't know anything about it, whether you are intentionally trying, when we talk about media messaging, that's why it's so important, because whether you are even intentionally doing it or not, you're starting to pick up these stereotypes that you think about Chicago. And so it's just fitting this horrible narrative so perfectly in your head, um, in a way that doesn't make sense. I also think, honestly, that it does also make a difference that Chicago, our Black population is so heavily Black American. And I think that does make a difference, right? Because
Mm.
we know that there is such a strong idea about how Black Americans are lazy or unworking. Like, like we don't work, we're lazy, we're not that smart. Like that has been a strong narrative from literally from slavery.
Right.
And we know that it's still like underlying so many things, and it starts to seep out when people start to show
Hmm.
their colors, right? And when you think about like, oh, well, the population of Black people, most of us from Chicago, we, came up, we migrated through the Great Migration,
Yeah.
came up from the South, right? Like we are, and we're proud of it, right? Like, and so
Yeah.
I think like reclaiming it and being like, yes, we are the descendants of enslaved people. We
Mhm.
are the descendants of people who picked cotton and who did these things in a strong and smart way, right? Like we have people who were fighters and who like made a better life for us, right? Like none of these are things to be upset about.
Mhm.
Um, I think that is really important.
I think as I got down here and now find myself as a resident of the South,
Mm-hmm.
I think I found it to be more important than I did before, uh, to learn about Black history from the standpoint of where we were before the migration.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and just even as much as I think when I first moved down here, there were folks who, on the flip side of that, we talk about misrepresentation,
yeah.
folks who view the South in a certain light, and we're like,
Yes.
you might not want to go down there, you might get lynched, or you don't want to go
Oh,
down there.
yes,
You,
yes, yes. And I'm in Florida now. I'm
yeah,
at my alma mater,
yeah.
which is a dream come true for me, right? And
Mm,
so many people just just were so like gave just gave horrible remarks to me.
Right.
People I barely knew would be like, "Oh, I can't believe you're going." Like, I don't even know you. What do you mean? Like,
But
I
in
can't
many
believe
ways,
you're
I
going.
feel like I've learned through like, just in my conversations with folks
Mhm.
here who are in African American history, folks here who curate at museums, people who I've met, like we're old in some ways, like a lot of the spaces and places here are places and spaces we built and our ancestors built.
Yes.
And in many ways, it's like if you go, I forget the brother that's from I want to say he's with the New York Times, and he wrote that story about how all Black folks
We
need to
should go
work.
back. Charles Blow.
Yes, Charles, and like this idea that we should go back to cities
Yeah.
like like a Little Rock, Arkansas, or like
Yes, yes, to rebuild political
yeah,
power in those places that have a big population of Black folks. And he did a documentary on it too. I think it was on.
yes, and more than ever, I'm like I think about that when how certain media outlets have framed that. It's just interesting to see that very similarly, the same way there's folks in the
Yeah.
South who tell me like, how could you be in Chicago? There's folks in Chicago who are telling
Mhm,
me, how could you
mhm.
be in the South? And it's like we have ties that bring us together if you look
Yeah.
at that historically, and I wish that there was more done to sort of represent that subjectivity in a way that we could change some of the narratives around how we see each other. And I guess that's more intraracial than it is interracial.
Yes, yes,
That being said, I think in this generation, in the digital age, storytelling and journalism means, as you alluded to, means so many different things, from just flat out social media content on one's personal page to, people having podcasts and docu-series that don't necessarily have to go through gatekeepers, can just be placed on Vimeo or YouTube. Uh, your work at Northwestern, I guess when you moved to the instructor role was pretty much focused on audio journalism, wasn't it?
yes, yes. Hmm.
What sort of drew you to audio storytelling, and why do you think audio storytelling is important enough to like have entire departments sort of dedicated towards this in,
Yeah.
in our journalism schools?
Yeah. So I think that one thing that really gets me about audio, in a good way gets me, is
Mm-hmm.
that it really allows you to focus on the emotion that we have in people's voices. Um,
Mm,
a lot of times when we are looking at visuals, we are distracted from the voice, right? Because we can see somebody's mannerisms. We can see how they're holding their body, how they're holding their face. Are they looking around? Are they looking happy, sad? Like, we kind of are looking at all that. We're not always as focused on their voice, right? It's why on social media, so many people watch videos and read the subtitles. They don't even bother turning on the sound.
mm,
When you are listening to audio only, you can hear certain types of emotions. You can kind of lean in and visualize yourself as that person, people you love as those people. Um, it also creates a kind of empathy a lot of times. And of course, not that TV and visuals aren't important, but it is just such an intimate form of
mhm,
storytelling, right? Think about like back in the early days where like you gather around somebody telling you a good story, you
mm,
know, or, back before we had TV and the really good radio stories, right? That would kind of like captivate the whole family gathered around the radio. And so it's like there's just something special about that, that no matter how much technology we get, somebody could literally be teleported with a hologram in front of into my living room. And I'm still gonna maybe sometimes prefer to hear certain stuff as
mm,
a podcast on demand, or on my radio, because I just appreciate that form. And so, but it's hard to do. And I think that we have a lot of noise in it because everything is categorized as a podcast now, technically, right? So there are going to be people, and there's a lot of people who just hit record and they just start talking for 2 hours and then they upload it.
Right.
That is going to be categorized the same as someone with prepared questions or in an edited story.
Yeah.
It has like we start off with an intro, then we kind of build up, and then we have there's a story arc,
Yeah.
or even like something more scripted. All of this is still a podcast. Like it's all
Yeah.
called the same thing, and we don't have really different names for these things.
Mm-mm.
And so for journalism students, I'm like, y'all are gonna know how to do like the technical. If you wanted to just upload some stuff, you can do that without me.
Yeah.
So I need to teach you how to script,
Mm-hmm.
how to do some of this type of stuff, how to report, right? How to pull in other sound, because that's gonna help you get a job
Yeah.
if you want a job in this kind of audio world. Um, it also helps break up the monotony because in journalism schools, you do a lot of writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that for me, when I was a student, for example, when I was a grad student, when I took audio courses, it really helped me use a different creative muscle
Mm.
because I would be so burnt out from writing. I mean, it's good writing because you need the practice. You need to do it. Like it is necessary. You cannot get away from it. But because of that, I need to do something else too.
Mm.
So
Mm.
even if you don't want to work in it anymore, because I don't know if I knew I would ever come back to it, at the time, it just felt good.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think oral histories are something that have always been kind of central to the ways in which Black folk communicate the
Yeah.
past. And so now more than ever, I think in this landscape, Black voices are finding audiences like never before. And Black stories are finding audiences like never before because I think uh, the audio storytelling as a modality has become more valued. And to your point, a lot of students are tired of writing, but a lot of students are using devices that are writing things for them, as well that don't necessarily give the richness or the perspective that you can get from, like you said, the actual texture of people's voices and the
Yeah.
banter that it happens between individuals in the room with one another. But that's one thing that I'm seeing even as a qualitative researcher, that folks are now starting to use artificial intelligence and generative AI in ways that are supposed to be solutions to make the work easier, but in many ways are sort of, I guess, diluting to an extent
Yeah.
what we were used to receiving in terms of stories being written, news stories being written, in terms of how questions are formulated, in terms of how editing decisions are made. What are your feelings about how what AI may bring to this conversation in terms of subjectivity, objectivity, or even representation of Black folk in particular in news media?
Yeah. I think that like we do know that AI could be beneficial for journalism,
Mm.
but the type of AI that could be beneficial for journalism is not like chat GPT, right? Like it's like a newsroom building a proprietary program that automates, like, for example, game recaps where they just plug and play,
Hmm.
this team won,
Hmm.
whatever, that type of stuff, or proprietary AI software that fact checks from their own database
Right.
of sources, right?
Hmm.
Um, so it is, the challenge is trying to teach students that like, yes, I don't want you to be afraid of AI, but like Chat GPT, for example, is not it. But like, for example, I'm teaching a class right now, and my students have to, report on report a, basically cover a beat. So I want them to cover the same subject area throughout the semester.
Right.
And I have them doing a beat report where it's basically just a way to help you do research. And one of my students um, used Chat GPT to help her do a new template because I sent them a template and
Mm-hmm.
she just wanted some ideas of other templates. And I didn't mind that.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just helping you brainstorm. Like that is totally fine. Or, like Adobe Podcast is will help you when you have issues with your audio. Maybe there's something in the background. Um, that's not something that you use every day and with all your tape, but it can help, right? And so, yes, let's use that, but also like I need to hear your original audio first
Right.
because maybe I could have helped you get better audio. So like I don't want you to just go to that. Like let's make sure that you know how to properly get audio in the first place. But maybe, you couldn't help it. The audio's bad. We still want to use it. Let's see if that AI tool can help you clean it up.
For sure. For
So, but I think the thing is that what I try to tell my students is that a lot of times, like if you the AI that you are using that is
Mhm.
available to you, if you try to use it specifically to write, you're not going to get a good grade because it's not going to write how I need you to write. I literally will tell you, I need this structure, I need this type of thing. And if you use it, it's not going to be a good story. So
Yeah.
just don't do it. Like it'll be different if it's like I need you to write a reflection or something like that. Like, no. It doesn't write good news stories.
No.
And realistically, as an interviewer, usually you're trying to ask questions that are not easy to Google and questions that are different than what other people would ask. So you want to think of the ones that are not the most, the ones that just jump out at people.
Right.
So to do that, you need to use yourself. So you are always going to be better
Mm.
than the AI in that point. So it's tough to kind of give them both of those lessons.
Right.
So that's what I'm always trying to do is like, I am not anti AI, but I am anti AI doing the thought process for you. You are smarter than the AI.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're lucky to be kind of situated generationally to have had the experience of going through stacks in a library or having had the experience of maybe looking physically through an encyclopedia or just being resourceful in a way that I think some of the folks in Gen Z didn't have to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, having an understanding of what this world was like pre-internet, you know, and then being given those tools almost feels like a cheat code for many of the folks that I talk to in terms of like millennials who are like, oh, I can use this for busy work, but then for the things that are substantive and need to be rich and meaty, like it's really just freeing up my time to think about the things
Yes.
that I need to do in a deeper fashion. But in terms of like, little busy work that maybe might have taken away from what I'm trying to do over here, it's helpful in
Yeah.
that way. And I don't know if you're coming up, and I feel for those who are in like, I guess what they're calling Generation Alpha, they don't know a world, not just, they don't know a world without Web 3.0. Not so I like to, there's Web 1.0, Web 2.0, Web 3.0. So like to not know a world without Web 3.0 is scary to me because then it's like there's no ability to be able to call on that skill set. Like even the idea, I get on my son all the time, he's 17, like organization, like he doesn't know where any files are on his computer. But I think because I actually held physical folders have to be organized in my computer. He didn't have that experience. So it's just kind of like we're going over essays for college applications, and he's just like, I don't know where that application, I don't know where that file even is. Is it in downloads? Is it in documents? Is it on the desktop? I don't even know, right? But I use him because he's an honor roll student and someone who I deem as someone who actually, for his age group, is above average in certain ways, but he still doesn't have certain fundamental resourcefulness, and I think that's a generational thing. But looking at that from a journalistic standpoint, I'm wondering how that's going to shape out, particularly in journalism schools, where students are
Yeah.
showing up only knowing how to use these tools as a starting point for writing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's gonna then dilute or in some ways print in particular, if how that's gonna reshape the profession. Are you seeing that at all on your campus, or are you seeing that at all in your students?
Yeah, I think already, students now, because we didn't grow up texting in high school, because
Right.
remember, we didn't have phones that really text. We had just got phones with prepaid minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and so now, everything is shorthand.
Mhm.
So I think that we already see students, their like basic grammar is just different.
Mm.
And so trying to not be, that person that's like, I can't, kids these days, right? It's like, okay, but we teach the kids these days. So how are we going to adjust, right? Like,
Yeah, meet them where they're at, but like, how can we give them some game?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, I think we're already seeing certain things like, okay, like for example, when you are typing, right, to put the period inside the quotation marks. But
Yes.
I can see why when you are on your phone, I think people, when they're on their phone, they don't think to put the period in the quotation marks because it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
And the sentence doesn't automatic like how it'll automatically put a period when it knows you're starting a new sentence, but it doesn't put it in the quotation marks.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I'm struggling to get students to put the period in the quotation marks. And I'm like, unless you're from the UK, people
Mm,
are going to judge you if you don't put the period in the quotation marks. And I know you're brilliant, but I don't want them to think less of you because you did not put the period in the quotation marks. So it's
mm.
like I'm already seeing generational differences like that. But that is actually, I saw that in Northwestern too. I saw that in Northwestern. I saw that here, right? Like, and I think that that's really from like text culture.
I think that's definitely a great point. I was talking to one of my colleagues here, and she was maligning about how like students don't read. But then we came further along into the conversation to think about like they do read, but they're used to reading text in the form of short form messages. They're used to reading text in the form of blog posts, text in the form of comment sections, text. It's very rare that they're reading books on their own, but they're reading a lot on over the course of their everyday lives. They might be on a Reddit thread, they may be
Mhm.
in Discord, they may be, they're reading a lot of text, but the
Yeah.
text that they're reading isn't necessarily in the form that we're trying to uh
Yeah.
force
And
them.
it's our fault too, like in as in our, I mean our generation, because they are also reading a lot. Like if let's say they're reading a Reddit forum,
Hmm.
a lot of those people on that Reddit forum are like millennials and Gen X.
They
And
are.
we don't it and a lot of those people on that Reddit forum are millennials and Gen X. And
Hmm.
if our punctuation and spelling and sentence structure is not right, they're gonna pick that up.
Hmm.
So they're seeing how we're writing in more relaxed areas and they are picking that up as well.
Mm.
So people forget that we have modeled social media writing and online writing for them. And then now we're getting mad that they're writing like us, as a generation. Not me, but us as a generation.
That's funny. Yeah, I think that is true. Like the idea of having, and maybe that's the blurring of the lines between the inside voice and the outside voice. Where
Yeah, yeah.
there used to be clear separation of like
Yeah, yeah.
how I write as a rapper is not how I write as a journalist, which is not how I write even as a researcher. Like it's almost different
Mhm.
languages of how, because even if I presented a an article that felt like journalism to an academic journal, I'm gonna
Yeah,
get ripped to shreds. They're gonna be like, this sounds too informal, or this
absolutely.
sounds no more than this isn't research. This is just
Yep,
investigative journalism. And like, there's different voices that our students are gonna need to have in their toolbox, particularly Black folk, because we tend to have inside voice, outside voice
absolutely.
anyway. But
Absolutely.
I'm finding that, you know, in in terms of professionalism and in terms of like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's cool that your blog gets X amount of views for this type of writing. But if you want to work for the Washington Post, you're going to have to shift.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
just about your views. It's not just about your followers. It's not just about your audience. They're still going to want you to fall in line with the culture of this newsroom and how stories are presented. And that there is a standard for
yeah,
outlets and how
yeah,
they present voices. And so you're going to have that in your tool belt as well. Um, you know, I'm wondering, and this is the probably my last question. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Um, I'm thinking about you being at FAMU, and I'm sure this has to be like a almost a full circle
mhm.
moment for you in teaching down where you did undergrad at. Um, where do you sort of see the future of like Black owned media in particular? And also, how do you see HBCUs sort of playing an integral role in sort of cultivating the workforce with more representation and with more outlets and with more vantage points that sort of are nestled in Black subjectivity and an ethics of care that dates back to institutions like the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier. Like, where
Mhm.
does that go into, you know, the next decade or two?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely think that we are going to have more smaller, independent Black publishers. I don't think that we're going to have those big behemoths that we had in Chicago, right? Like the Chicago Defender, Ebony and Jet. Like, we're not going to have these big, massive publications that could take up large buildings of employees and create bureaus across the country. Or like Ebony and Jet, they had international bureaus, right? That's how large they were at one time. We're going to have small independent publishers who are doing really great work, right? And that's what we've been seeing, right? Like, I think Capital B is doing really great work, and they have like, now they have Atlanta, they have Gary, Indiana. Like, they're targeting places that they see as having large Black populations and needing Black coverage. um I'm a subscriber, I pay monthly, right? And so I think it's really important for us to kind of like support them and help them grow. We have the Tribe in Chicago. So
Yeah.
having these much smaller ones who are doing really fantastic reporting, um, and they're doing a lot more with less, but just also giving them grace, because they're not going to be able to cover just every single thing. Um, because of the fact that they're just, they're smaller operations. But I think that that's what they're doing, and I think that more of our students are going to do that, right? They're not gonna feel comfortable working for a lot of these large publications.
Mm.
um they're going to want to do their own thing, and I think that that's okay. That's what a lot of our ancestors actually did, right? Like, they
Yeah.
made their own, and they had to, right? Like, they couldn't work at white publications, and they had to make their own thing. And I think a lot of people are going to start doing that. And I think that as HBCUs, we have sometimes traditionally really focused on helping people get corporate jobs. I
Mm,
know at SBI, or that's the School of Business and Industry, when
mm,
I was a student, that was the thing, right? Like how, like connecting students with these corporations to get them hired. And I think that that's really important for some students, but for the students that don't want those jobs, helping them and supporting their entrepreneurial dreams. Um, I actually just connected with a professor yesterday, and I'm going to start kind of being a facilitator for this kind of incubator program that we have that helps like students and groups when they want to kind of start a business, right? And but it's just very simple. Like this, what are some of the just basic things you need to know when you're starting a business, right? So even if it's you're a creator,
mhm.
right? Like how do you pay your taxes on
Right.
the money that you're getting from these companies, right? Like what do you need to know? Um, how do you organize yourself? So
Mm,
just some of that type of stuff. How do we kind of help them and support them? Because a lot of them are going to be super successful and we can just support their different pathways. And I think that keeps them connected versus saying this is the only way you can be successful. And if you're not this successful, you're not the ideal alumni, right? Like as we continue our, like for us, it's excellence with caring. And I think that we can continue our excellence with caring by thinking about what they need and not just what we want them to do.
mm,
So when I'm in class and I'm like, well, how many people in this particular class want to be reporters? And if nobody raises their hand, I'm like, no problem. Let's talk about how this could help you if you want to be a PR person, if you want to work in strategic communications, whatever, right? Writing this news lead is going to be similar to writing a press release, right? Like, how can I make it make sense for everybody?
mm, mm. Well, I thank you for that perspective. I feel like, as much as I've spent time doing this gig and being around a lot of journalists, because I feel like I'm outnumbered greatly about like folks who have spent decades in newsrooms. I still um, find myself often um, curious just about how this whole thing has a future ahead of it that in some ways is still uncertain for a lot of our people. As much as we are visible, at many times I'm still hearing folks who have great amount of experience tell me that this is in flux. We don't know where this is headed. How do we plan around this? What is our plan as a school to safeguard against some of these changes that are occurring? And so I'd love to definitely hear perspectives like yours that gives me hope and gives me a bit of optimism about what it is we're doing, uh, and the fact that I will have a job in a decade. What it is that I'm doing. Before I let you go, I have one question that I actually have been asking almost every person that I've interviewed, no matter what field that they're in. And that's just for the sake of, my own curiosity, is what is a piece of media, and it doesn't have to be confined to any one medium, that
Okay.
gives you joy in this moment that you're in or this, whether it's this month, this week. Is
Hmm.
there a podcaster that you're enjoying? Is there a television show you're enjoying? Is there a musician? Is there a book? um it could be as simple as someone's Twitter feed. I don't know. Is there a
Okay.
particular piece of media that is giving you joy in this particular moment?
Well, I mean, as we think that we are coming towards the end of TikTok, I have been loving it more and more, especially this week. It has been top tier funny. Like TikTok has always been funny, you know. I am one of those people where I'm like, oh no, TikTok got me through the pandemic, right? But it's like everybody just turned up their funny this week, right? The comment section is funny. Like it's like so the video itself will be hilarious and in the comment section, and I will just be just like, scrolling in my bed, cracking up laughing when I should be asleep. But it's always good to get some laughs out at the end of a hard day. So yeah, TikTok, please just somebody save it. Save TikTok, please.
Well, the timestamp this for those who may be listening to this at a later date. This is January 17th, and on the
Today.
19th,
Yes,
they're
yes.
shutting this down. They're talking about shutting this down. So hopefully, by the time this episode is uploaded, we'll hopefully be able to laugh at the idea that maybe they fooled us and they
Yes,
told us they were
yes,
going to get rid of it, but they brought it back. And
yes.
we're not mourning TikTok the same way, a platform like Vine, which just disappeared
Yes,
in the air.
yes.
Uh,
Mine was so good.
oh, I mean, I thank you for joining us, or joining me rather, for Uncommon Knowledge. I am happy with this episode, and I can't wait for the audience to receive it. And again, I'm going to give you your flowers because you've been someone who's been inspiring to me, and I hope you
Same.
continue
Thank
to do the
you.
work that you're doing because you are a shining star in the field. And so I thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
Thank you. Same, same.
All right. Peace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, Sense82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.